Good afternoon, everybody. Third time is a charm, as they say. We were trying to start inside the base of the lighthouse, but as anybody who has visited us knows, you don't get any cell service or Wi-Fi in the base of that lighthouse. The brick walls are just a little too thick. So we're trying a third time here from the keeper's cottage. We'd be outside, but the weather has taken a turn for the worse here on the island. After a beautiful weekend and Monday, it is cold and it is chilly, and there is quite a thunderstorm brewing. So Chris, our executive director, is in the safety of the doorway at the reproduction keeper's cottage. I'm going to brave the elements out here so we can get a view at least of the door of the lighthouse back there. So anybody who climbs Old Baldy knows that right before you go in the entranceway of the lighthouse, there's a plaque up there. And there are 3 items on that plaque. First of all, it says 1817. This lighthouse was finished in 1817. Now, one of the biggest secrets of the Old Baldy Foundation is that we don't know when Old Baldy was finished, nor do we know when she was lit for the first time by Sedgwick Springs, the first keeper here at Old Baldy Lighthouse. We get April 1st, 1817, because that was the day the contractor was supposed to finish the lighthouse from the original contract produced by the federal government. So that's why it says 1817, and that's why we come up with April 1st, 1817 as her birthday. It's just kind of the deadline for the contractor. Now that contractor, his name is up there. That's the second out of 3 items on that plaque above the door. His name was Daniel Way. And Daniel Way arrived on Baldy Island around Christmas of 1816, and he didn't have to begin from scratch. If you recall, there's a lighthouse on Baldy Island that predates Old Baldy. It was finished in the mid-1790s by a contractor named Abishai Woodward. Now, Abishai Woodward was from New London, Connecticut, the same town Daniel Way was from. So there is this hypothesis that perhaps Daniel Way was an apprentice, was a former employee of Abishai Woodward, and that is how Daniel Way, first of all, knew of Baldy Island and was interested in contracting to build the lighthouse down here. And that is why Old Baldy is not too dissimilar from the previous lighthouse. The federal government didn't want to start from scratch. They, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Follow the same kind of model or method. And Daniel Way learned from his former employer, what we believe was his former employer. So if you're listening out there, give us a shout out on the comments here. I'm following along now that we have a little bit of Wi-Fi, or at least I think I am. There we go. So I'd love to know where you're listening from, what your connection to Baldy Island is. We have quite a few listeners. And if you have any questions, let me know. I'm going to have to restart mine here because it is still a little funky.
But we have Abby Overton is watching.
Abby.
Casey Overton, that's Abby's sister-in-law. Hi, Casey. I forgot where you're listening from. Mackie's on. Mackie Miller.
Hey, Mackie. Uh-oh, yeah, my phone is not happy with me.
Ah.
All right.
Well.
So, and the third item up there on that plaque above Old Baldy is R. Cochran. It stands for Robert Cochran. It's the customs collector for the Port of Wilmington. He was the man that you paid your taxes when you entered the Port of Wilmington, and a portion of that went, of course, to the federal government. He was the tax man. And along with being the customs collector, that automatically made him the supervisor for the lights, for the lighthouses in the lower Cape Fear region. So it was kind of like if you were a customs collector, these other obligations and responsibilities came along with the job. So that's why it says R. Cochran on the top, founder, AD 1817, and then on the bottom, D. Way, builder, with 3 items on that beautiful little plaque above the door. Hey, Mary, Casey, Mackie, good afternoon. Hello, everybody. Mackie, you couldn't agree more, one of our favorite topics. We have quite a few listeners. Let us know where you're listening from. We'd love to hear from you out there. So when Daniel Way arrives here, again, he didn't begin from scratch because there was that previous lighthouse, so he had knowledge from perhaps his former employer, Abishai Woodward, who had completed that previous lighthouse, but he also had the materials. Remember, there are tens of thousands of bricks that were delivered from Philadelphia onto Bald Head Island to construct that unfinished lighthouse that was begun by the state of North Carolina. Well, when they deconstructed that lighthouse, they left the bricks there. And Daniel Way used flatboats and barges to float some of those bricks from the original lighthouse site, which is arguably now underwater, about a mile southwest of here. He floated them across up into the mouth of the river. He entered this marsh or the creek system to my right, to your left, and he dumped them off at this site that was selected for Old Baldy Lighthouse. So Old Baldy Lighthouse arguably is a big old example of recycling or adaptive reuse. They recycled the bricks from the previous lighthouse to construct Old Baldy. Perhaps not all the bricks were recycled, but we know that some of the bricks in Old Baldy predate her from that previous lighthouse. And that's not the only feature original to Old Baldy that the federal government and Daniel Way is recycling. They also recycled the original lanthorn from the original lighthouse. If you recall, that lanthorn was forged in Philadelphia by a blacksmith named Samuel Wheeler. I think it's curious, it's a connection to today. Samuel Wheeler forged that original lanthorn or lantern room during a yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. So in the midst of an epidemic, a pandemic like we're experiencing today, he's forging this original technology for the original lighthouse. That, of course, was taken off of the original lighthouse, lowered under the ground, and eventually recycled to be placed on top of Old Baldy. Well, that lanthorn became derelict, and it was replaced by a second lanthorn in the year 1850 at the direction of Winslow Lewis, who had a little bit of a monopoly on lighthouse technology throughout the early and mid-19th century. And yet again, after the American Civil War, that second lanthorn was in too bad of shape, so evidence suggests that they replaced that lanthorn with a third and final lantern, or lanthorn room, the one that you currently see today when you visit Old Baldy Lighthouse. Well, if you visited her, if you have known to see pictures of her, perhaps you haven't visited, but you know her based on online pictures, you know that one of the signature characteristics of Old Baldy Lighthouse is the fact that that lantern, or the lanthorn room, is off-centered. It drives someone like me nuts. I like symmetry, and it drives me a little crazy. Perhaps Chris can see it. It's not the best perspective. Maybe at the end we'll go over to a better perspective to see it all. Well, the reason that it's off-centered is, again, that's the third lanthorn room to grace the top of Old Baldy. It was also recycled, just like that original lanthorn, the first of the three. And they recycled a screw pile lighthouse. It was a particular type of lighthouse. There was an abundance of screw pile lighthouses all across the United States in the late 19th century. So there was abundance of these lantern rooms for the screw pile lighthouses. And when they recycled one to place it on top of her, that screw pile lantern room was much smaller than the previous 2 lantern rooms. In fact, it was so small that lantern room could not be both centered on the top of Old Baldy and still cover the off-centered hatch carved into the roof of Old Baldy Lighthouse you used to get up into that room through a ship's ladder. So of course you need to have the lantern room covering the hatch so A, water doesn't seep down into the lighthouse, and B, you can get up in there. Thus, that smaller screw pile lantern room could be off-centered and still be compatible with accessing that room. So it has nothing to do with weight distribution. It has very little to do with engineering. It's simply in order to save a buck or two, to recycle a screw pile lantern, to get Old Baldy working again after the Civil War. You think the Lighthouse Service is not thinking much about aesthetics or my appreciation for symmetry. They're just doing what needs to be done to get that lighthouse up and working again without going through an exorbitant amount of money to do so. So let's check out the comments here. Hi, Casey Overton. Yeah, hey, Casey. Remind us where you're listening from. I think it's up in Virginia somewhere. Sarah Davis, thank you. Well, thank you for joining us, Sarah. We appreciate you tuning in. Debbie, when this virus frees us, we are coming for the tour. Debbie, we are counting the days until you come and take a tour with us. So give us a call when we're all back to normal. We'd love to host you. Helen, good afternoon. Well, hey, good afternoon, Helen. I have so many photos of my girls in the lighthouse as they were growing up. Such a great history lesson. Thank you. Well, thank you, Helen, for supporting the lighthouse and bringing the girls here to learn a little bit of history and for having them tune into these videos. Mary, good afternoon. McCallie, hey, McCallie, what's up? Kara, you've been quite a follower of ours lately. We appreciate you tuning in again. Some really great listeners out there. We have all kinds of listeners.
Do you see Steve Wetzel is listening?
Steve Wetzel. Hey, Steve.
Well, Steve was one of our pirates when we did the Pirate Festival. So, Steve, I want you to post a picture of yourself in your costume for everybody. He's also the ECU pirate for the football games.
Correct.
Put a picture up, Steve.
Hey, Steve. Yeah, we want to see that Buccaneer outfit. So again, to recap, this characteristic of Old Baldy is that the lantern room is off-centered. That's because that's the 3rd lantern room to grace the top of Old Baldy Lighthouse. And it was from a screw pile lighthouse, recycled, placed on top of Old Baldy. Too small to be centered and still cover the off-centered hatch carved into the roof of the Old Baldy Lighthouse used to access that room. Now, the second characteristic that makes Old Baldy pretty unique and recognizable for thousands out there all across America, and perhaps even the world, is the fact that the lighthouse has this patchwork appearance. Well, that patchwork is called stucco. And the purpose of the stucco is to protect the 18th century and 19th century brick underneath the stucco. So to hold it all together, to protect that brick from the harsh coastal environment here on Bald Head Island. Very evident today. You can tell I might be shivering a little bit. Well, when they made that first batch of stucco, of course nobody really wrote down the recipe for the original batch of stucco, and stucco wears off and needs to be replaced. We have 2 patches missing from hurricane damage currently. So as different contractors over the years are patching and replacing stucco, they're following a little bit different of a recipe, which produces a little bit different of a color in the end, and 200 and some years of that patching occurring through previous contractors, she now has this patchwork appearance, or camouflage appearance, as the kids like to say. But that's a new aesthetic for Old Baldy Lighthouse. You see, while she was in service, while she was an official lighthouse, or later a harbor light, a range light if you will, she always would have been whitewashed. So Old Baldy would have been completely white, similar to Ocracoke's Lighthouse, just north of us on the Outer Banks. So all that patchwork, that different combinations of different recipes of stucco would have all been hidden by white paint, which of course would have been applied by the lighthouse keeper. So that's a pretty new appearance. And there was a conscious decision on behalf of the Old Baldy Foundation in the late 80s and early 90s to preserve Old Baldy Lighthouse rather than restore her. There's a subtle but important difference between those two words. If the foundation chose to restore the lighthouse, they would restore her to a specific time that they wanted. So let's say they were going to restore her to her appearance in 1870, when she was commissioned and finished, or 1935, when she was last in use. They would have chosen a date, and they would have restored her to the appearance of that date in which they chose. But that is not what the Old Baldy Foundation chose to move forward. They chose to preserve her, to basically stabilize the lighthouse, to ensure that no more damage or deterioration occurred. And with that decision, there was no need to paint her white, to whitewash the lighthouse. They were just going to preserve the condition they found Old Baldy Lighthouse in 1985. So thus, it has created this remarkable appearance that is recognizable by lighthouse aficionados and heritage tourists and day trippers and vacationers that love Old Baldy and love Bald Head Island. I've not gone to too many lighthouses, but there aren't too many that we're aware of that have this beautiful patchwork or camouflage appearance. So again, these are the two characteristics that make Old Baldy unique: the patchwork and camouflage appearance, and that off-centered lantern room. Lastly, we're going to stick on this themes of three. So 3 names on the plaque, 3 lantern rooms. Lastly, the last third, if you will, because the theme, I guess, today is third time is a charm. This is the 3rd time we tried the video. Is that there were 3 keepers' cottages on this compound throughout history. The first was made simultaneously with Old Baldy Lighthouse in the year 1817 by Daniel Way. We're not sure if they recycled some of the brick from the previous lighthouse or the previous keeper's cottage, like they had recycled the brick from to build Old Baldy Lighthouse. We're not sure about that, but it was brick. It was 2-story. It had a long porch on the front and on the back, 2 chimneys, 1 on each end. Those specifications were delineated by the federal government in the contract that Daniel Way signed when he began construction in Old Baldy Lighthouse. There was a second keeper's cottage, and that second keeper's cottage sat on the other side of Old Baldy, behind her from your perspective, over towards the chapel. And that is the keeper's cottage that we have the most photographic evidence of, because in 1893, Herbert Bamber visited Bald Head Island, visited keeper Sonny Dozier here at Old Baldy Lighthouse, and took a series of 4 photographs of the lighthouse and the keeper's cottages. It perfectly captures what that second keeper's cottage looked like, and that is why in the year 2000, the Old Baldy Foundation reproduced that keeper's cottage, in which Chris and the camera is sitting in right now to block her from the wind use the Wi-Fi. It is that second keeper's cottage that Herbert Bamber photographed that the Old Baldy Foundation chose to replicate or reproduce in the year 2000. And you can probably hear them hammering away. We're using this opportunity to fix up the roof since we're close to the public, so we're really happy that the roof is getting fixed. So there was a 3rd and final keeper's cottage on this compound. It was again built on the other side of Old Baldy Lighthouse, over towards the chapel. It was a pretty large keeper's cottage. Again, it was 2-story. It had a big front porch. There was 1 photograph that we're aware of of that keeper's cottage. It's based on a postcard that was produced during the Palmetto Island era, the Thomas Franklin Boyd era. If you're listening to a previous broadcast, you may have been familiar when we were discussing when the pandemic of 1918, the Spanish flu or the Spanish influenza, visited Bald Head Island. That was the keeper's cottage that Thomas Franklin Boyd's family found refuge in. And of course, that keeper's cottage burned down around the year 1931, and Old Baldy was decommissioned 4 years later in 1935, so it was never replaced and it was never rebuilt. Thus, as we discussed just a few minutes ago, the cottage that you all visit today here at Old Baldy Lighthouse is not original. It was built in the year 2000, a reproduction of that second cottage that we have the most photographic evidence of here on the Old Baldy Lighthouse grounds. So let's check out and see what's going on Facebook here. Kara, you may have already answered this, but we missed it if so. Jace wants to know, where does the name Old Baldy come from? Well, Old Baldy comes from the preservation movement in the late 80s. It was kind of an affectionate nickname given to the lighthouse for just kind of that good-natured, warm feeling to get folks motivated and invested in the preservation of this lighthouse. Throughout much of Old Baldy's time in the 19th century, it was known as Cape Fear Light or Cape Fear Light Station. And then in 1903, the federal government built the third and final lighthouse on Bald Head Island. That was the skeletal lighthouse out towards the Bald Head Island Conservancy. And once that lighthouse was lit for the first time in August of 1903 by keeper Charles Norton Swan, you may know him as Captain Charlie, they chose to name that lighthouse Cape Fear Light Station. And once Cape Fear Light Station was inaugurated, they changed Old Baldy's lighthouse's name to Bald Head Light. So I know that's very confusing, but when we're going through the official government records, this lighthouse has so many different names. You may compare it with this island complex and all its different names. This Cedar Island and Cape Island and Smith Island and Bald Head Island and Palmetto Island. Woo! It drives you nuts, doesn't it? So many names for one place. That's the same problem we have with Old Baldy Lighthouse. You see it as Cape Fear Light Station, Cape Fear Light, Bald Head Light, and now known since the preservation movement as Old Baldy Lighthouse. So great question, Kara. Appreciate you asking. Barbara, so Travis, if you were to restore her, what date would you choose? Woo, that's a good question, Barbara. Probably I would say this. I would restore her to 1893 when Herbert Bamber took those 4 photographs. I think that photography is relatable. Everyone can look at a picture and become intimate with the details in that picture, can immediately make a connection to those who are photographed, because we all have cameras in our hands nowadays. So I would choose that because we have 4 photographs of her in 1893. And I also would choose that date because that is when Sonny Dozier was the lighthouse keeper here. And the Dozier family is locally famous in the Southport area. And Sonny Dozier was arguably, I would say, the most famous lighthouse keeper here at Old Baldy Lighthouse. He has the most instantaneously recognizable name in this community. He also had a long tenure here at Old Baldy Lighthouse. He is the Captain Charlie of Old Baldy. So kind of 2 reasons. That's a really great question, Barbara. I kind of like answering that. So, Rosemary, Sherry, you might like this. Steve, ahoy, can't wait to come back. Yeah, we love it. Jonathan, go Pirates. And Mackie, they're saying there's no such thing as a stupid question. So here it goes. I thought the original lighthouse was eroded and just disintegrated into the ocean. How did the bricks and the lanterns survive? Well, Mackie, they deconstructed. Remember, they deconstructed that lighthouse before it washed away into the ocean. So they were able to recycle the lantern and the bricks. They made a conscious decision before they lost that original lighthouse to the ocean to deconstruct it, to salvage those materials, and recycle those materials for Old Baldy. And Debbie, Cape Fear and Bald Head names are familiar. You have cleared up my confusion. It is the same lighthouse. Well, remember, Debbie, there are two lighthouses we're talking about. Old Baldy started in 1817. It is located where we are right now. Cape Fear Light Station was started in 1903. That was where the Bald Head Island Conservancy is today. Old Baldy's still standing behind me. Cape Fear Light Station was destroyed via dynamite in 1958 when it was replaced by Oak Island Lighthouse across the river from Bald Head Island. We're just saying that the nomenclature, the official names, are very much interchangeable. Before Cape Fear Light Station was lit for the first time in 1903, records call Old Baldy Lighthouse, as we know her today, both Bald Head Light and Cape Fear Light. Just as Bald Head Island and Smith Island are the same. So it's very confusing, and it doesn't make our jobs here at the Old Baldy Foundation any easier. So hopefully that cleared that up for you a little bit, Debbie. Great questions here. What a really interactive audience this afternoon. We really appreciate bringing this to you all. Thank you, Donna. Excellent presentation. We learned a lot. Well, I'm very glad to hear that, Donna. So I'll delay here, see if there's any other questions from y'all out there. You've been a really engaging audience. So just a reminder, yeah, Old Baldy, she was decommissioned in 1935. She has not been in use since. There is a purely decorative light that was placed on top of Old Baldy in the early 90s. It serves no navigational purpose whatsoever, though. It's just up there, as I say, to look pretty. And of course, when all this virus is finished, you can come here, you can climb the whole way to the top. It's 108 stairs, 5 landings, and a 9-rung ship ladder into that lantern room where you can see all around Bald Head Island. And we're going to talk a little bit later, perhaps later this week or next week, about the Fresnel lenses and the technology that was up in that lantern room. And we'll be bringing that video up into the lantern room to discuss that. Some more comments here. Douglas Baker, you can see Oak Island Light from Old Baldy. I'm guessing with confidence that these are the only two in North Carolina that can see one another. Douglas, you know, certainly from eyesight, I guess that's true. I don't quite know, Douglas. Yeah, I guess so. I imagine maybe Chris can help out with this. There's probably no other light.
From the top of Cape Lookout, can you see Ocracoke?
No. Definitely.
Too far away?
Way too far. I'm thinking maybe...
Ocracoke and Cape Hatteras?
Yeah, maybe with binoculars from the top of Hatteras,
Yeah.
not from the top of Ocracoke.
Yeah, yeah.
Douglas, you're probably about right for saying that. I'm not confident, but I do think it's kind of cool that from the same perspective, you can see the oldest standing lighthouse in North Carolina and the youngest standing lighthouse in North Carolina from the same perspective. We point that out in the tour. It's kind of a cool concept to think about. The breadth of North Carolina's lighthouse history from one view shed is kind of awesome. Cindy, love your presentation. Well, thank you, Cindy. Barbara Grant, you're referring to Old Baldy as her. Are all lighthouses girls? This is what I've been told, because I've picked up this trait from others. Anything nautical is a her. There's no boats or ships that are he's. They're all hers. Flags are hers, like nautical flags. And the same concept goes with lighthouses. They're all hers. So I didn't make that rule. Maybe it's a bunch of hogwash, but it's a trait that I've picked up from other historians and other kind of nautical people. So I'm going to keep going with it. Debbie, so are you on Oak Island there? No, Debbie, we're on Bald Head Island. We're across the Cape Fear River to the east side of the Cape Fear River from Oak Island. All right, folks. Well, join us tomorrow at 10 a.m. for another edition of Quarantine Collections. And then again tomorrow at 2 o'clock, we'll be bringing you Touring with Travis. We'll take you to another location on Baldy Island. Hopefully the weather cooperates a little bit more so we can perhaps be a little more outside. Check out our website, oldbaldy.org. We have a wonderful online store where you can make orders for jigsaw puzzles and reading and awesome shirts that depict that off-centered lantern room that we just discussed. Also on our website, you might find information on April 8th, we're having a virtual historic happy hour discussing the history and the memory of the boathouse that this island lost due to Hurricane Florence in the fall of 2018. Douglas, enjoyed it. Thanks. Well, thank you, Douglas. Debbie, glad we got you on track there about Baldhead. To everybody else that's been listening on this really eventful broadcast here this afternoon, we appreciate your support. We hope that you and your family stay safe, that you all are healthy, that everybody is well. And thank you for all our essential employees and first responders out there, medical personnel, for doing what you're doing for this country. We really, we have your back and we have your support. Thank you very much for everything that you do.
I was just going to say one thing, Travis, a public service announcement. If you know of any teachers or your children's schools, please share this video with them. We originally started these videos to help support our teachers who were transitioning to online teaching and homeschooling. So we hope that these videos get to students, and you could help by sharing or sending a link to your children's teachers or principals. We talk predominantly about North Carolina history, but I'm sure any history class would enjoy watching these.
Absolutely. Great point. Share away, folks. The internet has been a beautiful tool as we've all been self-distancing, self-isolating. So share away. And thank you for listening, and we'll see you all tomorrow.